Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics. The government unveils strict new rules for fixed odd betting terminals. Ministers say it will reduce harm for the most vulnerable gamblers, but bookmakers say it will hit the industry hard. Could the UK stay tied to the EU customs union after 2020? The Prime Minister says nothing's changed, but some Brexit supporters are concerned, and we'll be speaking to one of them. His online lectures have won millions of followers, and his latest book is topping the global best-selling list. So how did this Canadian academic become a global sensation? Jordan Peterson joins us live. And we'll look at the similarities between a Punch and Judy show and Prime Minister's questions.
In the light of his U-turn on alcohol pricing, can the Prime Minister tell us, is there anything he could organise in a brewery?
All that in the next hour. And with us for the whole programme today, as we've said, is possibly one of the most famous Canadians in the world right now. No, not Justin Bieber or Justin Trudeau. It's the academic Jordan Peterson. He's back in the UK promoting his book, 12 Rules for Life, which, it's fair to say, has caused something of a stir. And talking of books, our other guest is Ayesha Hazarika, a former Labour Party special advisor, who's just written a new tome about the weekly political bout that is Prime Minister's Questions. More about all of that later on in the programme. Welcome to both of you.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you.
US President Donald Trump has officially confirmed that he reimbursed his lawyer, who paid a porn star to hush up her claims of an affair. The president's lawyer, Michael Cohen, has previously said he paid Stephanie Clifford $130,000 of hush money shortly before the 2016 election. Ms. Clifford, who goes by the name Stormy Daniels, alleges that she and Mr. Trump had sex in a hotel room in 2006. A new financial disclosure filed yesterday shows the president paid Mr. Cohen over $100,000 of unspecified expenses in 2016. Jordan, how serious is this for the president, I should say?
Well, I guess it'll depend on to what degree it reveals his lying. So I can't tell yet. I mean, part of me thinks it might be better for the political system in general to leave the private lives of the leaders alone. I mean, that's more of a proclivity in Britain, I think, to leave the private lives of politicians alone. But if it indicates well, family life anyways, it seems, compared to the United States.
Right, but what does it say about Donald Trump?
Well,
I mean,
he says he has strange taste in women. Right, that would be the starters.
And you talked about lying and whether there is an allegation here that he has lied. If he denies having had an affair, why pay hush money?
Well, that's a complicated problem, because sometimes people pay hush money so that a problem just goes away, even if there isn't guilt involved, although it does raise the specter of some sort of involvement. Sometimes it's easier to pay someone who's harassing you to go away than it is to do anything else about them. Now, I don't know whether that's an appropriate tactic or not, but I can certainly see why it might be one that beckons to you.
What does it say to you about Donald Trump?
Well, I think in the end, with these things, it's always the cover-up that gets you. It's not so much the deed, it's the trying to sort of lie your way out of it. But the big thing will come down to whether he's breached federal law with these funds coming from his campaign funds. And sometimes, it's a bit like the Al Capone thing. Sometimes it's a technicality that actually can get you into lots of trouble. But the fascinating thing about Stormy Daniels is that she is a woman that will just not be silent. She's a sort of female version of Trump in many ways, this sort of blonde, larger-than-life, I'm not going away, I'm not going to be. No, she's taking him on in that sense. She's absolutely taking him on. And also there are other sort of more malign parts to her story as well. She alleges that somebody sort of threatened her and her daughter's safety in a car park at one point. Again, if there's any links back to, Team Trump on this would look terrible. But what strikes me fascinating about her, no matter how much she gets abused, she gets a lot of abuse about her profession, the fact she's an adult actress and all this thing, she is a woman who is not going away. Right, making it difficult for Donald Trump. Would you have voted for Donald Trump if you'd been able to vote in that election?
I don't know. I mean, when I was watching the American election, I lived in the States for quite a long time, so I have a real affinity for the U.S. And when I was watching the election, for me it was a foregone conclusion during the entire process that I would have voted for Clinton, because I thought she had the experience to handle the position. But the closer the election got, the more I could feel a part of me think, yeah, if I walked into that voting booth, I could imagine in a fit of pique checking Trump and saying to hell with it. And so,
what would have caused the fit of pique if you said you identified with Hillary Clinton at that time? What changed then? What would have changed at the last moment?
I'm not happy with the tilt of the Democrats towards identity politics as a substitute for their conventional, focus on the valid concerns of the working class.
Okay, so you're unhappy with the identity politics that you say is associated with the Democrats in this particular case and Hillary Clinton. But doesn't Donald Trump indulge in identity politics to just the same degree, just different groups and different identities?
Yeah, but I would say that the sort of identity politics that Clinton engaged in cuts a lot closer to the bone for me because of my position in academia and the overwhelming predominance of the radical left amongst the humanities and social sciences.
OK, well, that's your personal experience. But let's just take a look and a listen to Donald Trump talking here.
We have people coming into the country or trying to come in. We're stopping a lot of them. But we're taking people out of the country. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people. These are animals. And we're taking them out of the country at a level and at a rate that's never happened before. And because of the weak laws, they come in fast. We get them, we release them, we get them again, we bring them out. It's crazy.
Right, just to explain, this is Donald Trump talking about illegal immigrants, but describing them, some of them, as animals. I mean, isn't that sort of rhetoric identity politics, just a different kind of identity politics?
No, I think you could make a case for that. I think it does appeal fundamentally to the distinction between conservatives and liberals, however, at a deep level, because conservatives are much more concerned with the integrity of borders and the fortification of structures within them, and liberals are more concerned with loosening the strictures between things. So I don't know if it's identity politics exactly with him so much as just appealing to his constituency.
But does that mean that you are sort of saying there is a case, a legitimate case, for calling some illegal immigrants animals?
Well, I suppose it depends on who he's referring to. If they're mass rapists, for example, then there might be a case. I mean, there are things that people can do that are more barbaric than anything an animal might conceive of. So I'm not justifying that, but I don't know precisely what he was referring to.
Well, I think Donald Trump plays a very base game. I think he does actually, ironically, pushing back against identity politics, I think he does do his own form of identity politics. And a lot of identity politics, you could argue, is about creating division. And he is the master of creating division. And his rhetoric around immigration, referring to human beings as animals.
Or Mexicans as rapists.
Well, the Muslim ban, as somebody from a Muslim background as well. But also at the same time failing to tackle things like gun crime. You know, there's a huge proportion of shooters in America who tend to be white men, but he's never prepared to take them on or challenge them in any way as well. His game is always division and how he can pit people against each other. That's how he sort of does reasonably well at the moment.
All right, let's leave it there for the moment. Now, the maximum stake on fixed odds betting terminals will be reduced to £2 under new rules announced by the government. At the moment, people can bet up to £100 every 20 seconds. And it's been claimed the machines can lead to gambling addiction. The Association of British Bookmakers has warned that there could be job losses and argued the problem of gambling addiction was a lot more complicated than just cracking down on the machines.
I think problem gambling is a much more complex problem than is associated with just one product. You look at your average problem gambler, they'll bet online, they'll bet in casinos, they'll bet in amusement arcades, and yes, they'll bet in betting shops. So what's needed if the government's to get a comprehensive solution to problem gambling is measures that work across industry, help identify problem gamblers wherever they are gambling, and gets the resources and the support to them to help them cure their addiction.
Well, joining me now is Matt Zarb-Cousins, who is a spokesman for the Campaign for Fairer Gambling, and here in the studio, Mark Littlewood, who's the Director General of the Institute for Economic Affairs. Welcome to both of you today. Matt, first of all, is this really going to curb people's gambling addiction? People will just go and gamble elsewhere.
Well, people who are already addicted might well go and gamble elsewhere. Hopefully they go and gamble on safer products, such as over-the-counter, or gamble on the machines at £2 a spin. But what this is about really is preventing addiction. And in order to do that, we have to acknowledge that the product itself plays a part in inducing and exacerbating gambling-related harm. And when you allow machines up to £100 a spin that facilitate roulette in high street betting shops, easily accessible environment, then we're the only country in the world that allows casino games in easily accessible environments at 3 spins a minute. And that is going to create more addicts. And that's the point of this measure. It's to prevent addiction.
Right, I mean, Mark Littlewood, I mean, it is quite incredible that you can spend that much money in such a short space of time. Even at a practical level, you'd think, well, actually, just by reducing it to £2, you're going to lose less.
Well, you can spend a lot more than that money in a casino.
Sure, but this is about easy, accessible machines, isn't it?
You'll find casinos in London not many miles from here, Joe. You can walk straight into, put £10,000 on a spin of a roulette wheel if you want.
I wouldn't know.
We're just going to find displacement activity here. It is relatively easy to walk into a bookmaker's on a high street. It is even easier to switch on your computer and have it wired up to the internet at home. So my challenge would be this. We've seen basically flatlining in terms of the problem gambling population. It's about 0.6% of adults and has been consistently for about the last 20 years. If this measure works, we would expect that number to fall. And if that number hasn't fallen within the next, say, 5 years, presumably we will repeal this measure.
Right,
No,
Matt Sabcosm?
Because only 1 to 2% of the population are problem gamblers, but 2 million people experience harm. What we need to do, if we're going to determine policy, is to look at the level of harm associated with fixed odds betting terminals, and only 1 to 2% of the population play fixed odds betting terminals, so it's not going to make a huge difference in the whole population rate of problem gambling, but it will make the machines less harmful, and we know that problem gamblers lose more on these machines than several leading gambling activities combined. And when someone goes into a betting shop for the first time, they don't go in to bet on fixed odds betting terminals. They don't even know, they don't advertise the machines. They go in to bet over the counter, and then the staff give them free credit and try and entice them onto the machines, and then they get addicted to roulette. So look, people will still go in betting shops, but bookmakers need to return to bookmaking. That's what they're licensed for.
No.
Well, Matt seems a bit confused about the efficacy of this policy. This is either going to get problem gambling down, or it isn't.
It's going to reduce the harm.
Well, there are some trade-offs here. I know the Association of British Bookmakers have said that up to 21,000 jobs of people who work in bookmakers could be on the line. 4,000 shops could close down. The Exchequer could lose £400 million in tax revenue. I would expect some pretty spectacular improvements in problem gambling for that rate of economic damage. And there is a straight trade-off.
Right, well, is there a straight trade-off, Matt?
Mark, I mean, you're an economist, allegedly, so you would know that if 1 to 2% of the population play fixed odds betting terminals and 480,000 people in the country are problem gamblers, it's not really, even if the level of harm associated with this particular product is reduced significantly by this measure, it's not going to necessarily reduce the overall population rate of problem gambling significantly. What it will do is prevent people getting addicted to this particular product, which we know is the most addictive form of gambling if you take into account the fact that 43% of people that use fixed odds betting terminals are problem or at-risk gamblers, and they lose more on this product than several leading gambling activities combined.
Well, it's rather making my point for me. It may very well be that you don't, in future, have problem gambling associated with fixed odds betting terminals. But very likely, these people will just be a displacement onto more people having problem gambling in casinos, more people having problem gambling online and the rest of it. So you have to actually have some judgment about the total number of people you're going to help.
All right, well, Matt, take us through, because you have some experience as to what it's like to actually use and play these machines. I mean, if we take Mark Littlewood's general point that actually you're just going to displace the activity, you will build up problem gamblers elsewhere. What's it like using the machines that you want to see banned?
Well, look, when you start gambling on these, well, you go into the betting shop for the first time, you want to bet on sports or racing, and then you see the machines, obviously they give you free credit, and you go on, you start betting what you can afford. No one sets out to be a problem gambler or get addicted to gambling, but because of the nature of the product, the fact that it's 3 spins a minute, it's very fast, it's very high stakes, you can stake from £1 up to £100 a spin. Look, it's incredibly addictive and enticing. Look, what I'm saying is, if regulation is needed elsewhere, look, stake reduction we know is the most effective way of reducing harm associated with a particular product. That's what the research shows, and that's what the government's acted on. And if that needs to be applied to other modes of gambling, then so be it.
All right, let me bring our other guests in. Aisha, first of all, do you back what the government is doing?
Yeah, I do. It's absolutely the right decision. And also I do pay tribute to Matt. He's campaigned really long and hard for this. And to take some mea culpa, I think the last Labour government did make a mistake by, deregulating this to this degree, and there was a proliferation of these sort of machines. But I think to Mark's point about the economics, I think there is a knock-on benefit which you might not be readily able to capture immediately in terms of, if you look at the sort of opportunity, cost and damage of a lot of the effects of gambling, it is a blight on people's lives. It can affect their mental health. People can become so addicted they sort of lose their jobs. There is a big kind of
there's
social...
a cost to society.
There is a cost. And
Although
I think,
it hasn't worsened since
to...
the rates of problem gambling were the same in 1997 when Labour came to power. So it's not obvious that actually the gambling liberalisation under the Labour government from 1997 onwards worsened the problem in aggregate.
The ease at which people can get into, as you said about the casino, you're right. I mean, it is a wee bit, like if we wanted to go and do a bit of gambling, then we'd have to put a bit of effort into it. We could go into a betting shop really, really easily and get onto one of these machines. So there are some natural obstacles.
Not so much on your computer, which you can switch on immediately.
Right, we'll come on to the online.
Can
I just talk about addiction? I mean, listening to this discussion, do you accept and agree with Matt that the way these particular machines are devised leads to a much quicker route to addiction?
Yeah, I think the clinical literature on that is clear, and the machines are designed precisely for that purpose. They use a kind of reinforcement strategy that can hook people in very rapidly. And the problem with them often is that they're people who have cognitive impairments or who are elderly, who are suffering from cognitive control problems, are particularly susceptible.
Right, so would you support regulation, tighter laws to restrict and, on this case, obviously bring the stakes right down?
Well, it seems to me at least that bringing the stakes down helps minimize the potential for harm for the populations that I just described.
What about banning the machines altogether?
Well, that's a more complicated issue. I don't know enough about the particulars of these machines in the context of the gambling industry here to say anything particularly intelligent about that.
Right. I mean, the thing is, the machines aren't being banned, so it is just about the stakes coming down. So I don't quite see what the problem is broadly in terms of people still being allowed to gamble.
I think it will effectively be a ban. My understanding of the monies behind this, that if you cut the stake by that much, the profit margin collapses, these machines become non-viable. So you can actually effectively ban products and services by fixing prices, even if you haven't actually legally prohibited them. So most likely, my judgment would be these machines will be ripped out of the high street, and most likely, unless we're actually going to ban the ability to go to a computer and find a roulette wheel, then we're only banning a particular type in high street.
The question is, in part, is there any social good that these machines produce? You could argue that the government needs to allow and regulate gambling because that's the least amount of harm that can be done, given that people are likely to do it anyways. But it's very difficult to make a case that there's any social good that's associated with gambling.
Right.
A lot. I would say. I mean, I spend most of my annual leave in Las Vegas. I love it. I get fun out of it. Right. It produces jobs for croupiers and bar
you can
staff
obviously control yourself.
The overwhelming majority of people can. So gambling per se, I think, is a good. It is a social and an economic good. It brings fun to a lot of people, and it creates a lot of jobs and economic activity.
Matt, do you agree with Mark that actually it is an effective ban? I mean, would you like to see the government be even tougher when it comes to these kinds of machines?
It's an effective ban on the roulette content. The machines will still be slot machines and they'll still be in betting shops, B3 content, what's called B3 content. But when the bookies brought these machines in, they did so in a very much a legal grey area. They said that because the server that determines the result of each spin is outside the premises, it's the same as betting on a horse race. So therefore, that's how they sort of Trojan horsed roulette and casino games into their shops in the first place. And then it was legitimised in the 2005 Gambling Act, and the minister said, well, look, it's £100 a spin, that's quite high, it's quite unusual. If there's evidence of harm, then we can reduce the stake.
All right.
And it has taken a while, but we're back to that now.
All right, Matt and Mark, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Now, the Prime Minister has today denied that the UK is climbing down over leaving the customs union. This follows a report in the Daily Telegraph claiming that ministers have agreed as a last resort to remain tied to the customs union beyond the end of the transition period. Speaking to the media at an EU summit in Bulgaria this morning, the Prime Minister emphasised that the country would be leaving it along with the rest of the EU.
The United Kingdom will be leaving the customs union as we're leaving the European Union. Of course, we will be negotiating future customs arrangements with the European Union, and I've set 3 objectives. The government has 3 objectives in those. We need to be able to have our own independent trade policy. We want as frictionless a border between the UK and the EU so that trade can continue, and we want to ensure that there's no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
Theresa May. Well, joining me now is Steve Swinford from the Daily Telegraph, who had the splash on the front of his paper today. So just give us more detail about the story, Steve.
Joe, I'm delighted to be here. And what we learned was that on Tuesday, the Brexit War Cabinet agreed to what's called an Irish backstop, which means that as a very last resort, if all of the plans are not in place, we would essentially keep a customs arrangement with the EU in which we'd be tied to the customs union effectively, would be aligned to it. So the government is today formally denying that we will be in the customs union, but that doesn't mean that we won't still be tied to a lot of it. And it's really upset Brexiteers, the prospect of that.
Right. Oh, yeah, but it won't surprise you, obviously, that this has been denied, that nothing has changed, that Theresa May, as we just heard there, is saying that we will leave the customs union when we leave the EU. Is it also the case, as you wrote, that Boris Johnson, Michael Gove were outgunned at that meeting, that they in the end reluctantly agreed and signed up to this idea because Brexiteer influence is waning in the cabinet?
That's correct. They essentially swallowed the idea. They raised strong objections in the meeting, but it wasn't ultimately a resigning issue. No one's quitting the cabinet and no one's leaving the government. There are still big fights to have over what our customs arrangement with the European Union looks like after Brexit. They want to be there for those fights. So they've reluctantly agreed to it, even though they don't like it.
Right, but isn't the point, though, that to some extent, Theresa May is right in saying that we will leave the customs union and the single market when we leave the EU. It's just the mechanism by which we do that still needs to be agreed. And so the backstop, as it is only in play until that mechanism has been decided upon, whether it's the maximum facilitation and technology that deals with this frictionless border or whether we have some sort of customs partnership.
That's exactly right, and Downing Street's argument is that they can have their customs solution, whether it's a customs partnership or MaxFAC as it's known, or something in between, and they can have that all ready by the time the transition period ends, December 2021. But officials are sceptical. They think it will take a lot longer to get ready, and that actually we need a bridge, we need a way out of that in case things aren't in place. So we could end up in a position where we are still technically tied to the customs union and have to follow a lot of its rules and possibly even end up paying money into the European Union still. It's not clear yet how that process will work.
All right, Steve, thanks very much for joining us. Here in the studio is the Brexit supporting Conservative MP Bill Cash.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes.
Bill, disappointment for you then. Your colleagues in Canada have lost the argument.
No, because we've just heard from Stephen what he's said, and I think he's right. We've just heard from the Prime Minister too. But there is another factor which hasn't yet been mentioned, and that is that this backstop is part of a draft agreement that was prepared as a result of a meeting on the 8th of December last year. We've heard Coveney refer to it, Varadkar and all the rest of it.
Let's just explain what that backstop is.
Yes.
Tell the viewers exactly what it means.
Well, what it means is that there is a final option C, which they say would mean that we would have to fit in with the regulatory alignment of the customs union in relation to the Irish north and south.
In order to keep it frictionless.
In order to keep it frictionless.
Right.
However, the fact is that that agreement is not a legally binding document. It is not yet part of the withdrawal agreement.
Right.
And it is, I mean, we had a meeting yesterday with Karen Bradley, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, in front of my committee, the European Scrutiny Committee, and we went into all this. And the plain fact is that it is not binding. And it may be that there are people talking about it, but it is not a binding agreement.
Right, but the fact that it's not
so
binding...
option C is not actually binding on the United Kingdom.
But it is an option, isn't it, Bill Cash?
It's something that's being talked about, but nothing is agreed until everything is agreed.
No, but it is an option. And it's an option that you don't support, and nor do many of you.
I certainly don't.
Right.
No, I don't like the idea, but the fact is that what is an idea is not necessarily an obligation.
Right.
And there is no obligation. There are loads of things, Joe, that are being discussed at the moment with contrary views as to whether they're good ideas or not. The question is, what will actually happen?
Yes.
And that will be decided by a legal obligation obligation in an agreement.
Right, well, let's talk about what might
Okay.
happen. Everybody says they want a frictionless border.
Yes.
Everybody says
And
there
no
must be
hard
no
border.
hard
No
infrastructure.
hard border.
We've heard
We've
it.
heard it over and over
Yeah,
again.
exactly.
3 cheers.
The problem is that neither of the potential solutions,
Mm-hmm.
the customs partnership, which you don't support, and the maximum facilitation, which everybody says at the moment is not possible.
Well, you
Might
say
be. Hang on,
everybody.
let me just
Wait a
finish.
minute. No.
Just let me finish. It's not
Everybody?
possible. So the EU, many people in your party, many people across Parliament. If it's not ready, let's imagine that there is let's imagine there's a technical solution, and it's not ready by 2020, but it's ready by 2023. So are you prepared to stay in the customs union until then?
Can I just make the point about the money, which Stephen
answer that
because
question.
if we stay in after the 30th of December 2020, in other words, on the 1st of January 2021,
yes.
a huge bill, which I've already pointed out from the European Scrutiny Committee, will mean another £5 billion.
Right, but that's not the answer to my question. Would you be prepared to do that?
Well, the short answer is I certainly don't want to, but this is an objective which is currently being discussed. We're in the business of ideas, not legal obligations at the moment. I can't make myself... We must not give in to ultimatums from Tusk, Barnier, Varadkar, Coveney. That's what they're doing.
And Remain Tory MPs?
I'm talking... yes, that could also apply.
Right. What's Labour's position? Not really that much clearer, is it?
Well, Labour have said that they would want to stay in some customs union. I mean, I think what the Prime Minister is proposing, whether it's sort of a full plan or being talked about, is broadly sensible. I mean, if you're going to have an extended period, I mean, why wouldn't you use that on a pragmatic basis? I mean,
you might never get out of it.
Well, I mean, do you know how you see it, Bill? It's almost like we're running up to the cliff edge, but we're giving ourselves a longer run-up period.
Actually, it's like an escalator. You get on the first steps and you can get off, and after that you can't.
I think we cannot underestimate the Northern Ireland situation. I think we here in London gloss over it quite lightly. So it's something can be sorted. I mean, I was in Belfast just last week, and people are raging about it. It is an issue. And we are playing with their lives and their future, the strength of the Good Friday Agreement.
There's a great deal of
well,
disinformation
I think people in Northern Ireland do know what they're talking about with the greatest of respect.
Well, I'm talking to Northern Ireland people as well, and I have to also say that yesterday in the committee proceedings, we went into this, it was in public, it was on television, it's been seen by people, and the fact is that all this talk about cameras, there are cameras there already, round
but
the
you know what, Bill, that is not how people are feeling
I don't want to intrude on
Northern Ireland right now.
From an outsider's perspective, Jordan, are you a spiritual Brexiteer?
I have some sympathy with people's desire to disentangle themselves from rulers who are too far away in the power hierarchy from them.
What a good point.
Why?
Well, because as people move away from you up hierarchies, it's harder and harder for them to represent you properly at a local level. And I also have a tremendous amount of faith, I would say, all things considered, in the people of the UK to muddle through properly, because they've been doing that for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
So, I'd bet, my sense as a Canadian is that I'd bet on Britain.
All right.
But I appreciate that, but that's a kind of nice platitudinous sort of statement, because we've got, we've had a huge period of austerity. People are really struggling in parts of the country now. We've had a wage freeze.
4.3% unemployment.
We've had a wage freeze in this country. We're in a cost of living crisis. We haven't got enough money for our schools, for our hospitals. The economy does matter. Nobody voted to be poor. It's all very well giving the patriotic language of freeing yourself.
4.2% unemployment.
Right, and on that, before this takes over the whole programme, I'm sorry, Bill Cash,
Joe, very
we have
nice
to
to
let
see
you
you
go.
again.
You need to leave.
I have to go indeed.
So, for more reporting and analysis of Brexit, check out the BBC News website. If you haven't done already, I must say it on a daily basis. That's bbc.co.uk/Brexit. Now, one of our guests of the day, Aisha, used to be an advisor to the Labour leader, Ed Miliband. So she'll be interested in the apparent changing political landscape since last year's general election and the recent local council election results. It seems more than 1 million Labour voters have moved out of London in recent years and into traditional Conservative constituencies. But it's not all good news for the party. In order to win the next election, Labour need to win seats in towns in the Midlands, where the Tories have just gained council seats. Our reporter Elizabeth Glinker explains.
When it comes to politics, there are certain things we assume to be true. The leafy home counties will always vote Conservative. The industrial towns in the Midlands and the north of England will vote Labour. But in a post-Brexit world, some analysts think that could be starting to change. In the last 4 years, more than 1 million people moved out of London. Some London leavers moved to cities like Birmingham and Leeds, but around 2/3 moved to the counties surrounding the capital, where the Conservatives are traditionally dominant. The suggestion is that these voters, who are disproportionately young, well off, and might have traditionally been expected to vote blue, could be sowing the seeds of change.
There are many areas in the southeast and in the home counties that traditionally we'd expect to be solid Conservative seats. However, in recent years, they've seen an influx of young people from London, a high number of graduates and people that voted Remain in the EU referendum. That means that in the long run, these are areas that the Conservatives should probably be concerned about losing to the Labour Party.
In the 2017 general election, Labour increased its share of the vote by 10% in the east and southeast of England, just as the Conservatives lost seats in places like Canterbury, Bedford and Reading. A YouGov poll of 25,000 recent London leavers found 66% were Remain voters, which in turn had influenced their decision to vote Labour in recent elections. It means that over time, those true blue home counties are becoming that little bit more like London. So, should the Conservatives be worried? Well, at the same time, in other parts of the country, the converse seems to be true. Areas like Mansfield, Walsall North and Stoke South, which voted overwhelmingly to leave in the EU referendum, flipped from red to blue in 2017. This trend was reinforced by the recent local election results, with the Conservatives winning in places like Nuneaton, Derby, Dudley and Walsall.
There is a very live debate within the Labour Party about whether, because Labour is doing so well in cities, that we ought to focus our energies there and make sure that we speak for that younger, liberal demographic in cities. But the truth is that would not only be a breach of our moral responsibility to many people in this country and a great break with our history, it would also be a dead end for us electorally.
For the first time in nearly a decade, the most recent electoral test, this month's local elections, did not deliver a lightning bolt. But that doesn't necessarily mean that normal service has been resumed.
Blinker there. Well, let's talk political landscapes, changing if they are, with the Conservative MP Neil O'Brien. My other guests obviously are still here in the studio. What does your party, the Conservative Party, need to do to improve its chances in cities like London?
Well, I think there's a few different things we've got to do. First, we've got to keep going with the strong economic record that we've got, where we've brought down unemployment, got more people in work than ever before. And then secondly, as we move out of the time when we've been having to clear up Labour's massive deficit, the biggest deficit since the Second World War,
yes,
we can start to... I know it sounds boring, but that's
not
what we've
boring,
had to do.
it's just that it's quite a long time ago.
It's what we've had to do, and it's because it's such a big deficit, the government borrowing a quarter of all the money it was spending when we came in. But as we move out of that, we can have a more positive time, and I think it will be a time where we can start to invest more in the NHS, to have stronger growth in the public services, and to have that mix of strong public services and under-control taxes that I think most people in this want,
well,
rather than a kind of lurch off to the left.
You've had that message for quite a long time, haven't you, Neil, in terms of your economic message, and it hasn't worked, not in London. It hasn't gained traction. So I put it to you, is that because, in part, the mantra Brexit means Brexit, appealing perhaps to a more Leave audience, is not going to endear yourself to what is seen as a very Remain city?
Well, I think there's two things to say about that. The first is we've got to respect the result of the referendum. I'm an MP in the Midlands, and you just talked in the video you showed about the number of seats that we won up in the Midlands, and all the people in my constituency want to see that result respected. But on the other hand, we do have to also deliver a Brexit that works for the 48% of people that didn't vote to leave, and that's why the Prime Minister is going for a smooth, orderly Brexit that also works for business and keeps trade flowing. And that's what we need to do on Brexit. But we need to do a lot more than just Brexit. We need to show that we are a party that is comfortable with modern Britain, that celebrates some of the good things that migration has brought to this country, and some of the people have come here and built businesses, like in my constituency, which is on the edge of one of Britain's most diverse cities. So it's a matter of getting the turn right. We do need that economic message, and we haven't, I think, talked enough about the progress we've made. But we do also need to show that culturally we are, as well as investing in the big public services, comfortable with contemporary Britain.
Is there also a problem, though, demographically for the Conservatives in terms of age? because the maxim that, you know, you vote Labour when you're young and then you vote Tory when you're older, heart and head sort of thing, that is still in play, isn't it, if you look at the statistics? And you're not going to be able to win a majority unless you address that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. So, in one way, the country's become a lot less polarised. I mean, we had our best share of the vote among working class people that we've had since 1979. So, on class grounds, we've got less divided, but on age grounds, we've got more divided, and that's why we need to do big things on housing. And I'm very glad that we're reviewing what we've done on tuition fees, and we need to come up with some big things to help young people get on in life. And I think that's one of the big challenges as part of the new think tank that I'm setting up that we're going to be looking at.
Well, Neil's got a point, hasn't he, when it comes to working class voters? Are the Tories now becoming the party of the working class, not Labour?
No, I wouldn't go as far as saying that, but I think what we saw at the last set of local elections is that we're sort of stuck. Britain's in political stalemate at the moment. We haven't really moved on that much from the general election. The study that John Curtis did for the BBC showed that if there was a general election based on the local election results, Labour would actually be the largest party but wouldn't have enough to form a sort of coalition government. So my analysis of it, still doing a lot of stuff with the Labour Party but being quite critical of the leadership, is I think you have the Labour Party becoming the party of the younger voters, metropolitan voters, educated voters, students as well. The Conservatives appealing heavily to those former UKIP areas, Leave areas, older voters, rural areas, those shire towns as well. And I think what's going to become really interesting at the next general election is actually, if it continues like this, Scotland may well swing what happens in terms of who becomes Prime Minister.
Well, that is important, obviously, for everybody, particularly in terms of the Labour Party and what has happened. You work with students, obviously, an awful lot. Do you think that does still hold, that psychologically students are more left-leaning at that age, and then when they get older and when they get a job, or, you know,
I don't know if
they
it's because of their heart exactly. It might be because they're not very happy at being at the bottom of the hierarchy. But they are there primarily because they're young. But I also think that the Conservatives have an opportunity to appeal to young people by appealing to elements of psychological well-being, let's say, that aren't normally addressed in the political realm. So I think young people are very hungry now, especially the youngest of the young, for a message of personal responsibility and the freedom to make their way in the world, and support and encouragement for that. And I've seen that start to happen among the Conservatives in Canada to fair good effect. So, and it's not easy for Conservatives to deliver a message to the young, but I think one of opening up opportunities for them to live the kind of life they want to live if they're going to take responsibility.
Well, hang on, all one at a time. Neil first, then I'll come to you, Aisha.
I think Jordan is right about that, actually, and I've started to notice some younger people coming into the Conservatives in my own constituency, and the shine is definitely coming off Jeremy Corbyn, particularly having done things like said, you know, I will get rid of all your student debts, and then saying straight after the general election, oh no, actually we can't do it, we'd never worked out how much it would cost. I mean, that's ridiculous. If you had a bit more of a mainstream leader, I think we would be in more trouble, but I think ultimately people are not going to go for Jeremy Corbyn, but that doesn't mean that over the longer term, we as a party don't have a challenge.
Right, let's just be careful with our language, because Jeremy Corbyn didn't say, I'll get rid of all your debts.
Yeah. That's what he said right on the front of the NME. That is exactly what he said.
Those weren't the words he used.
I will deal with it.
You've interpreted it that way. Yes, Aisha.
I would probably push back a wee bit on what Jordan said, because I think one of the things that we saw in the last general election campaign about what motivates young people is not just stuff for themselves. They also have a great concern for things like the environment and public services, the health service, and also how we treat people. What are our values in society about being an inclusive society, a tolerant society? I know you hate identity politics, but that actually, you know, matters to quite a lot of young people. And I think
that's because they haven't been told a better story than that.
Well,
yet.
I think they feel what they do in their heart at that time, and they want to be sort of kind and inclusive. But I think the struggle, I would say that the two policy areas which you have touched upon, which, unless the Conservatives get some movement on, housing and debt, student debt, is such a big issue for people. And I think particularly on housing, which I think, to be fair, no political party has quite cracked what the solution is. But the idea that you say to, you know, a generation, and this is where the capitalism argument is coming into, how can you say to a younger generation, be wedded to capitalism when they have no capital and they have no means of acquiring capital?
I actually agree with a lot of that. And on the environment, I think it's been really impressive the way Michael Gove has taken that issue and run with it. banning plastic waste and stopping on the litter accruing in our oceans and our streets. So I think that's an important start. But I agree with you about the housing point. Now we need to, as well as being able to build enough housing, we also need to think about the balance between the rented sector and ownership, and maybe use the tax system to change that balance a bit. So I actually agree with you there.
Just finally, I mean, Jordan, you say that actually students and young people haven't heard a better story than the one that they have been fed, it seems, up until now. But actually, if you're looking at the parties, Labour and the Conservatives here, and let's say Democrats and Republicans in America, how do parties tailor a message that has to bridge a lot of different groups in order to win an election outright, in order to get a majority that is needed here, without actually having to perhaps tone down some of their core messages?
Well, I mean, I do think from my experience talking to young people in droves over the last 2 years, I think that the best tack for the Conservatives is to indicate their willingness to open up the economic forum to genuine progress for young people and to have them play a part in that. I mean, part of the reason that the leftists are attractive to young people is because they feel that the system is actually stacked against them in a fair competition. And unreasonable housing prices certainly play into that, and unreasonable levels of student debt as well.
But why should they have a stake in capitalism when they have no capital?
Well, because they're not going to be young forever. And one of the best predictors of whether or not you have capital is how old you are. So most of the people that are rich are old, and you basically trade in your youth across your life for age.
You don't naturally accrue wealth if you don't start with something just because you get older. So
well, you can start with lots of things that aren't merely capital.
But we now have a situation where people are still having to live with their parents into their sort of 30s and 40s because they can't get the money together for a deposit. So
I think there's also, we started by talking about our cities, and that's a really important point. I think initiatives like the Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands Engine have been really important in terms of regenerating those big, great cities.
Although I would just come in there and say that the cuts to local councils in some of these areas have been incredibly sort of damaging to the communities
as well. All right, Neil, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there, but thank you very much for coming in. Now, one of our guests of the day, the other one today, is a man you may recognise, or maybe you don't. Jordan Peterson has achieved that rare feat, becoming a global superstar academic. So how did he become so well known? He first came to national prominence in Canada in 2016 in a debate about new laws on gender identity. Bill C-16 made it an offence to refuse to call someone by their chosen gender pronoun. Jordan Peterson argued that this would infringe free speech, while some supporters of the bill said he was advocating prejudice. From there, his YouTube star took off, and he has now over 1 million subscribers. And his videos, where he talks everything from identity politics, which we've touched on, to the Bible, to Disney movies, have been viewed over 150 million times. Gosh, that's about the same number of viewers we have on this programme. Last year, he supported ex-Google employee James Damore, who had been fired for suggesting men and women have different interests due to biological differences. And his latest book, 12 Rules for Life, has taken him on a global tour promoting his ideas, and just this week he sold out the 1,000-seater Emmanuel Centre around the corner here in Westminster. So Jordan, you've done endless interviews. You've been publicising your book, and they've generated plenty of heated debate.
No, I actually sold out the Apollo. It had 5,000 seats.
All right, stop boasting. Do you think, though, because of the heat that has been generated, that your views have been misrepresented at times?
Oh, definitely, but that's, that's part and parcel of the process. I did take a very forceful stance, let's say, against some of the excesses of the radical left-wingers, and it's in their best interest to paint me as somehow a figure of the extreme right, because then I don't have to be contended with. But, I mean, it's easy for people's views to be oversimplified in a very large public debate.
I mean, in terms of some of the issues, I mean, you say you've been painted as an extreme right-winger.
No, some people have tried that. Not very successfully, but they've tried it.
And you came to prominence in part over your opposition to this law that we just talked about in Canada, proposing the use of preferred pronouns for transgender people. Just for clarity...
Mandating them.
Yeah.
Right.
Saying that you should do it.
No, that you had to do it.
Right, you had to do it by law. But just for clarity, do you think a trans woman is a real woman?
I don't really like the way those questions are formulated. I don't know what that means. What do you mean, a real woman?
Well, I'm asking you, in your mind, it depends what you think a real woman is, but do you think a trans woman is a woman?
No.
Why not?
Because I think that women are capable, generally speaking, of having babies, and they have female genitalia, and they have an XX chromosome, and I think the biological markers are relevant. It doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think that people should be treated with respect and dignity if they happen not to fit easily into a gender category. That's a different issue.
Right.
But it's a matter of definition, and I actually think it's a foolish argument in some sense, because what do you mean by real?
Well, I mean, you've just clarified that, though. You don't think that a trans woman is a woman. And do you think that that is what is behind or explains your opposition to this idea of a law mandating you to use a preferred pronoun, is because you don't actually believe that that's the truth, that a trans woman is a woman and therefore you can't use that pronoun?
No, that's not my argument at all.
Really?
Yeah, really. My argument is that the government shouldn't compel voluntary speech.
No, but I know what your argument is, and
no,
you've
but
made
that's
it very
really
clearly.
But that's exactly it. There's
but the motivation
There's
behind
no motivation behind it.
But you don't believe
I wouldn't
a
have
trans
put
woman is a woman.
everything on my online in my life to take the stance I did unless I had thought that through very deeply. And I've thought it through very deeply. There aren't hidden motivations that have to do with some arbitrary prejudice against trans people.
Okay.
It's pure and simply this. There's never been a time in English common law history where the government compelled speech, and the Canadian government dared to do that. And that was unacceptable. And they masked it with this show of compassion for the oppressed, and I don't buy it.
Right, but you would, as I think you said, at an individual level, if somebody asked somebody asked you to use a particular pronoun, you would do so.
Well, I have.
You have?
Yes.
Right, fine.
Yes.
Let's talk about feminism. Are you a feminist?
No, not as it's currently defined, certainly not.
No, well, in any other definition?
Well, I think that anybody who doesn't think that the competitive landscape should be opened up for equality of opportunity is not thinking. And so everyone's interests are better served if people have as equal access to opportunity to display their talents and to manifest their talents in the world as possible. So in that sense, certainly. But feminism now, and this is why it's so deeply unpopular, a very small minority of women in the UK identify as feminists. And the reason for that is it's primarily become an ideological weapon. And it's an ideology that I detest, actually, the ideology that it's associated with, collectivist ideology.
Right. I mean, OK, and that's your view about feminism. Aisha, are you a feminist?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a very proud feminist. And when I was a special advisor in government, I worked on women and equality issues, and I was very proud, actually, of a piece of legislation I got on the statute book with my former boss, Harriet Harman, the Equality Act in 2010, which strengthened our anti-discrimination laws. And I fought very hard to get more women into public life, into the Labour Party. And I'm very, very proud of being a feminist, hence my pink dress.
Oh, well, all right. Obviously reverting to type then in
Absolutely,
the pink dress.
well.
You would like men to regain or reclaim their strength physically, mentally and morally. Is that broadly correct?
I would say morally, fundamentally, but I think the other things go along with that.
Right, and if that
But it isn't men precisely who I'm speaking to. It's people. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm actually interested in individuals, and I'm interested in their fortification against tragedy. You know, every time I do an interview, the interview is always political. It's always political.
Well, the clue is in the title of this programme. We are the Daily Politics.
No, fair enough. No, look, fair enough. And I'm not casting aspersions at this programme, but the fundamental news that's important about what I'm doing isn't the political element. And the people who talk to me don't talk politically. They say they've watched my lectures.
But part
and
of it is that I think for a lot of people the kind of personal does become the political.
Or the political becomes the personal.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the...
but in this situation, a lot of people are wrong, because primarily what's happening is people are watching my lectures, and as a consequence, their lives are improving dramatically.
Oh, I'm sure they are. I'm sure people are have had a huge conversion after, and they're much happier once they've been.
It's not a conversion.
But what I would like to do is kind of almost... I think at the moment the discussion about feminism is very divisive, and sometimes it can sort of be like, OK, men have to lose and women have to gain. Actually, everybody has a lot to gain by greater equality. Now, whether you get the equality of outcome that you want, I think only time will tell. But certainly, equality of opportunity is very important. And actually,
we can agree on that.
And a lot of men would benefit from that. So I think a lot of men are having a lot of crises at the moment in terms of mental health, suicide issues, their own sense of identity, because I think some of the stereotypes put on men are quite limiting for them as well. I think they make men quite unhappy as well.
The devil's in the details with regards to equality, because I'm an advocate of equality of opportunity. But
and
I think
outcomes.
the idea, outcomes, that's an appalling doctrine.
Why?
All right. Well, hang on.
Because you have to produce an unbelievably potent bureaucracy to make the ever greater and ever finer distinctions that are necessary to enforce equality of outcome. How many group differences are you going to equalize across? Is it just gender and sex? How many genders?
No, so
gender and ethnicity? How many genders?
I think
how many ethnicities?
How
many races?
We'll let Aisha answer.
I think what people are trying to do with this, and certainly as somebody who has looked to sought to sort of do this myself, I think you set yourself ambitions for what you would like to see, and then you try and remove as many of the structural barriers and obstacles. So you try and create that fair crack of the whip and that equality of opportunity to see where you get to with the outcomes.
That's
now,
fine.
We are in very early stages. It's only 100 years since women got the vote in this country. We have had a long established patriarchal society and set up for a long time in the world in this country. So I think we have a long way to go to see where it plays out. There is no country in the world where we really do have gender equality properly yet in terms of real decision making and real
some of the
power.
Scandinavian countries maybe,
but they're still not quite there. And I think you've spoken a lot about this. There's still a way to go in Scandinavia. Things are not perfect in Scandinavia.
I haven't spoken about that specifically. I've spoken about.
You spoke about the right stuff yesterday. You talked about the Scandinavian.
Well, I've spoken about the fact that, see, one of the things that's happened in the analysis of the differences between men and women is that the social constructionist claim is that the differences are socially constructed, right? Is that it's a consequence of environment that men and women differ. But what the scientific literature indicates is that as cultures become more egalitarian, like they have in Scandinavia, the differences between men and women actually increase rather than decreasing, which is a direct repost to the social constructionist view. So they just deny all that. The biggest differences in the world in interest and temperament are between Scandinavian men and women. It's exactly the opposite of what everyone predicted.
Can I just pick up on one thing you said a little earlier in the interview, which you said it's the moral guidance that you are focused on. You think that is particularly important. How do you square that with the behaviour of perhaps arguably, a prominent alpha male president of the United States, Donald Trump? When his behaviour, he is accused of having an affair with a porn star when his wife was pregnant. How does that fit with morally reclaiming?
I would say that was rather clearly immoral.
Right.
Yeah,
but you would still,
not to be a target for emulation.
But you still would have voted for him over Hillary Clinton as an identity politics. It's just how
none
do
of that
you
was on the table, and I said I might have voted for him on a whim. That's all.
But you also did say you started out feeling quite close to Hillary Clinton. Can I just come on the
very quickly, because we've got to move on.
In a way, I don't care what Trump does in terms of his private life, but what I don't have is him stopping or potentially stopping other women having agency over their reproductive rights and lots of men taking those decisions.
It's all about where the moral outrage lies and what's more morally outrageous in people's eyes. Is it his behaviour or the identity politics for you? Anyway, we'll have to discuss this another time. For political geeks like us, Prime Minister's Questions, broadcast here on The Daily Politics, is, of course, our highlight of the week. Well, one of the highlights of the week. But for Prime Ministers and leaders of the opposition, the weekly session can be a terrifying experience. Our guest of the day, Aisha Hazarika, used to advise Ed Miliband on how to take on David Cameron at PMQs. She wrote all the best jokes. She's now lifted the lid on those behind-the-scenes preparations in a new book called Punch and Judy Politics. We'll talk about that in a moment. But first, here's a reminder of some of the more Punch and Judy moments from PMQs.
I'm fed up with the Punch and Judy politics of Westminster. The name-calling, backbiting, point-scoring, finger-pointing.
There's only one person I can remember round here knifing a foreign secretary, and I think I'm looking at him.
Give us a kiss, give you a kiss. Well, in the light of his U-turn on alcohol pricing, can the Prime Minister tell us, is there anything he could organise in a brewery?
That's the way to do it.
The day after his shadow chancellor was asked on the television, could he think of one single business leader? And do you know what he said? Do you know what he said, Mr. Speaker? He said, Bill somebody. Mr. Speaker, Bill somebody's not a person. Bill somebody's Labour's policy. Weak, weak, weak.
I want a kinder politics, a more caring society. Don't let them reduce you to believing in anything less.
When the Prime Minister wrote at the weekend that she wanted as little friction as possible, was she talking about EU trade or the next cabinet meeting?
Oh, the Right Honourable Gentleman's afraid of an election, is he? Afraid! Afraid! Frightened! Threat! Couldn't take it! Couldn't stand it!
Mr. Speaker, it's not so much the Iron Lady as the Irony Lady.
A boss who exploits the rules to further his own career. Remind him of anybody?
People work hard and save hard to own a car. They don't want to be told they can't drive it by a Deputy Prime Minister whose idea of a park and ride scheme is to park one Jaguar in order to ride away in the other.
If I'm looking for advice on what to wear or what not to wear, I think the very last person I would look to advise is the man in the baseball cap.
I know he's very keen on summing up policy in 6 words. Well, how about this? You are the weakest link. Goodbye.
It's a laugh a minute, isn't it, PMQs? Well, you tried to make it so, didn't you, Aisha? What is the secret of a good performance at PMQs?
So you need a couple of things. I think you should stick to the same topic for your 6 questions because it allows you to sort of have some direction of travel. I would keep your questions very short. The worst thing is to have a very long, rambling question because it gives your opponent time to think on his or her feet. And a bit of humour, a memorable line, a sort of peroration that can give your side something to cheer and that someone will remember. One of the most famous things actually you played was John Major and Tony Blair. Tony Blair on Europe absolutely kebabbed John Major with 3 words: weak, weak, weak.
Yes.
And that was like the cherry on the top of the cake of this argument setting out why he was such a weak leader on Europe. So a good Prime Minister's questions like that absolutely cuts through. It gets onto the media, it gets through to the public, frames an argument and it lets your side cheer.
Jordan, do you like PMQs? You'll no doubt have a Canadian equivalent.
I'm overwhelmed with admiration for them.
Right. Do you think it is as difficult as... I mean, they do say it's unbelievably difficult, it's unbelievably time-consuming. Some leaders are better at it than others. But psychologically, do you see the importance of being a winner or a loser?
No, I see more importance in the ability to actually engage in the game. I mean, when I watch that, I think that's the real alternative to genuine combat. It's like to have those very, very difficult discussions all articulated out in a place designed for that. Everyone acts in a civilized manner. It's a bloody miracle as far as I'm concerned.
Except that most of the comments we get are, it's too combative, it's too rude, it doesn't
if there's
enlighten...
no blood, it's not too combative.
We are absolutely as one on this, and I think you need that heat in PMQs. Politics is about passion. It's 2 tribes coming together, and I'll tell you something. As much as people do moan about it, saying, "Oh, it's old school."
Yes,
playground.
like a playground.
But if you sanitised our parliament, if you want a well-behaved, docile, quiet, meek parliament, look to Pyongyang, look to Beijing. Right. We have, the mother of democracy here, partly because of the noise and the fact that it's badly behaved. If you can handle yourself...
it's not a playground, because on a playground people actually fight physically. And so this is unbelievable.
It's only one step away, though, Jordan.
But that's
I don't know if you've met Dennis Skinner yet.
As long as it's one step away, then it's functioning properly. And things should be as combative as they can before they enter the domain of physical combat. It means that the system is working properly.
Well, thank God we've had no fisticuffs on this programme so far. I'm going to say thank you very much to both of you for being guests of the day. Both of you have got your books, 12 Rules for Life, Punch and Judy Politics. No fight broke out at the end, thank goodness, not physically anyway. That's it from all of us here. Have a very good afternoon, and I'll be back tomorrow. Bye.